Chapter 1. Stanford Litchwick put forth a spectacular and silly lie, one his feeble brain had failed to vet for plausibility before the words tumbled out of his mouth. He claimed to be an avid fisherman from Oregon, just in town for a couple of days. Wine cellars convention over at the Imperial Palace. Want to get a jump on the tourists and snag some triggerfish before sunup. The least he could have done was check the convention schedule. There wasn't a commercial wine cellar within 50 miles of Biloxi this week. His claim of expert boating and fishing skills was an equally egregious whopper. The closest Stan had ever come to the helm of a seaworthy vessel was the 2 months he'd served as coxswain on the Sacramento prep crew, a job he'd gotten because of his rail-thin frame and the steady supply of Tijuana Red he'd shared with his crewmates. One phone call would have blown Litchwick's story to smithereens, but Tattoo Charlie, the name Stan had assigned to the sad-eyed drunk behind the counter at Biloxi Boat Rental, didn't seem to care that his only customer of the afternoon thought port and starboard were after dinner drinks. The old geezer raised a gray eyebrow and stared at Stan's Birkenstocks and Earth First T-shirt. "Triggerfish," he said as the ash on his Pall Mall defied gravity. "That's the plan." Had Stan bothered with a 5-minute Google search, he'd have learned that recent El Nino currents had driven the gray Gulf Coast triggerfish southwest toward Galveston. "What sort of gear you taking out?" Tattoo Charlie asked. "Gear? Yeah, fishing gear. Oh, well, you can know. Standard stuff, Triggerfish gear." Stan rubbed his palms and calculated the number of steps to the nearest exit. He felt sure he could beat Tattoo Charlie out the door if it came to that. The old sot didn't seem up for a foot race. Tattoo Charlie shrugged, grunted, and slid a clipboard across the dirty linoleum counter, not knowing or caring that he was leasing a 20-footer to someone who had recently gotten seasick on the lazy river ride at Bananarama Water Park. It would have been easy for Stanford to use a phony ID and fake credit card. He had plenty of both, but this time he wanted reporters to spell his name right. Even though his mug had made it above the fold in numerous newspapers, the only time a print journalist had attempted to identify him was when Stan had hurled a wooden sign that read, "Save the World. Kill a Republican at a presidential motorcade." Then and only then did a reporter ask his name. To Stanford Litchwick's dismay, the next day's Oregonian identified him as Stan Ford of Lincoln. This time would be different. He'd used his personal Travelocity account to book his flights to Mississippi and rented the Ford Focus with his MBNA visa. He'd paid for the room at La Quinta with his American Express and given Tattoo Charlie his Oregon driver's license to lease the boat. Helen Keller could follow this trail. "Rates for 24 hours, Tattoo Charlie said. "No problem, oh." Stanford put his credit card and license back in his wallet and broke into a wide grin. "Going out alone, are you?" "Yeah, I always fish alone." Stan hitched his camo pants like John Wayne. Tattoo. Charlie pulled one more drag off the Pall Mall before ushering Stanford through a back door and onto the dock. "You'll want to use ammonia," the old man said once they were outside. "What?" "Clean it with ammonia. Masks any residue." "Residue?" Stanford's palms exploded with sweat. "From, fishing." That's when it hit him. Tattoo Charlie thought Stan was a drug smuggler. "Oh, I'm not, course. If I was off duty, I could sell you some industrial cleaner. Stuff will put a 3-day buzz on a bloodhound." "But I'm not." Stan stopped himself. Having Charlie think this was a drug thing wasn't so bad. "I also got some Coast Guard scanners," the old man said as he tossed the butt of one cigarette in the Gulf and lit another in one fluid motion. "Best to know who's in the neighborhood when you're trolling for triggerfish." "How much?" Stan asked. "Well, if I was off duty." He took a long drag and expelled a blue cloud into the warm breeze. $2.50 for both the cleaner and a scanner. "When do you get off duty?" Charlie raised his left arm, the one sporting skin art of Captain Hook getting a blowjob from the chicken of the Sea Mermaid. He squinted at his watch and said, "Why, funny you should ask. I get off right now." "Lucky for me, huh? Fishermen make their own luck. You're a good fisherman, ain't you, boy?" "Getting better by the minute," Stanford said. That night, after the last star had disappeared behind a thin layer of clouds, Stanford took the wheel of his rented Sea Waver like a caricature from Hemingway's Drunken Nightmares. Squinting and wiping puke residue from his chin, Stan took an extra wide stance as the boat bounced through the choppy surf. He couldn't see shit. The waters off Biloxi were dingy in the daytime. At 2 in the morning, this was like driving through a coal mine. The only light glowed from a dim orange beacon. Stan did his best to point the bow at the thin light. He had no clue how lucky he'd been. Any other morning, fog would have made it impossible for him to see his feet. A low-pressure cell had delayed the atmospheric blanket for a couple of hours and provided Stan with ample time to complete his task. So far, Stan's biggest challenge had come when a school of dolphins thumped the side of the boat looking for food. Captain Litchwick hooted, cursed, and came within inches of falling overboard when the mammals began chattering off the starboard side. "Christ almighty, get hold of yourself," he said out loud. 20 minutes later, Stan cut the throttle, hit the spotlight, and stared in awe at his target. The piling looked like a giant phallic idol popping out of the water and extending 50 feet into the inky sky. He could barely see the tiny beacon that warned wayward aircraft away from the concrete monstrosity the mobile register had dubbed JER, the largest engineering project since the TVA dammed every aquifer in the region. Stan's boat rocked closer as waves broke on the concrete. He needed to hurry. The lawn, he was out here, the better his chances of being spotted. Using ambient glow from his spotlight, Stan lifted the aft cushions and removed a steel case containing blocks of C-4. 6 bricks were overkill, but they were shooting for spectacular. He would bring down this piling tonight. Soldiers from the Planetary Liberation Front would sabotage the others in coming weeks, while Stanford spread the message from whatever federal torture chamber the jackbooted neocons tossed him into. The Point Oceanis Bridge must be stopped no matter what. That was the creed. They had chanted it in Jackson, painted it on walls, in Oxford, and spammed it to every politician in the state, along with a nasty virus that gobbled holes in the Mississippi government's operating system. But none of the suits had taken heed. The governor had responded with the mealy-mouthed press release that said, "In part, we understand and appreciate the concerns of certain groups, but the Point Oceanis project will proceed. All necessary steps are in place to protect the natural beauty of our great state." Yeah, this monster was a real beaut, but that didn't matter now. No one would ignore them after tonight. Their message was peaceful, but if violence had to be used as a tactic, well, this was war. Stan tried not to ponder the hardships awaiting him in prison. His features were just delicate enough to catch the eye of a sex-starved yard boss. God only knew how his digestive tract would react to institutional food. He couldn't think about that. He had to focus on more pleasant things, like the Che Guevara status he would obtain within the movement after tonight. The front might even put him on a t-shirt and hold free Litchwick marches on the Capitol. That thought brought a smile to his tight, cold face as he wiped mist from his eyes and fumbled with the Reynolds wrap encasing the C-4. It wouldn't be long now. 5 hours later, Jolene Newberry kicked off the sandals she'd bought on sale at Target and stuck her toes into the water along the shell-strewn Biloxi beach. Jolene was registered in room 1223 at the Beau Rivage, although she'd spent a grand total of 5 minutes in the room in the past 18 hours, just long enough to put her Samsonite bag on the hot pink bedspread, christen the toilet, and touch up her baby blue eyeshadow and exotic rust-brown lipstick. Then she'd wriggled into the tightest pair of jeans she owned and donned a thick brown belt with a silver buckle, the size of a pie plate. One final glance at her oversized ass in the mirror, and Jolene had trotted downstairs where bells dinged, lights flashed, and the promise of untold riches beckoned her to the gaming floor. Now, with brown sand washing between her aching toes, Jolene stared out at the sunrise and wondered how. Things could have gone so wrong. She'd followed every word of the dog-eared How to Beat the House paperback, including the part on picking 3 slot machines that hadn't paid out. When 3 machines near the roulette wheel sat silent for 15 minutes, Jolene parked in front of them for the better part of 2 hours. Sure enough, after shoving a beach bucket full of quarters into the one-armed bandits, Jolene hit it big. Her payout was $1,000 after investing only $370. She was 6:30 to the good when she walked away from the slots and answered the siren call of the blackjack table. By 1 a.m., she had tripled her $1,000 payout by counting the cards, just like the book said. By 3, her stash had dwindled to $500. When she walked through the tinted glass hotel doors a little after 7, she had lost all her winnings plus $700 of her own money, all the cash she had brought. For the week, Jolene thought about stripping naked and swimming out to sea where she would either drown or be eaten by sharks. Anything was better than calling Odell. Who would take great glee in his goddammits and I told you so's. Fantasies of drowning quickly passed as Jolene examined the water. Mississippi Sound always looked like an oil tanker had ruptured offshore. The state had created 26 miles of shoreline, the largest and longest man-made beach in the world, and then rebuilt it bigger and better with FEMA money after Katrina. Still, not an inch of it was worth a damn. Barrier islands from Petit Bois to Bay Boudreaux kept the tidewaters murky and the beaches bland. It was like God's giant practical joke. Mississippi really was the sewer of the Gulf. The rising sun glistened off an oil platform near Dog Keys Pass as Jolene let the waves wash over her ankles. She watched the kaleidoscope that is a Gulf Coast sunrise while practicing her speech to Odell. That's when she felt a stab on her Achilles tendon. "Oh, hell hath no fury," Jolene shouted as she jumped away from whatever creature had chosen that moment to nibble on her leg. Unfortunately, an ocean wave hit her just below the knees as she made her leap. Before she could scamper back to shore, tidewater knocked Jolene's feet out from under her, and her rump splashed into the Gulf. Another wave broke onto Jolene's sleeveless Jordache top as she listed to starboard and stuck her palm into a pile of seaweed. Soft sand caved under her knees as she tried to right herself, and a splash of black salt water filled her mouth. Once upright, Jolene spat and spewed water while swatting sand off her face. She shook her head like a wet dog and did her best to push the mats of hair out of her eyes. That's when she saw the item that had been nipping at her ankles. Staring back at her from shore was a charred, tottering, severed head, the jagged edge of his 4th cervical vertebra still clinging to a few shards of skin from Jolene's ankle. Her screams attracted a retired couple from Ocean Springs out for their constitutional, as well as an off-duty cop who had chosen this stretch of beach for his morning run. The cop vomited. The retiree called the peace officer a nadless peckerhead. Swearing he'd seen worse at Guadalcanal, the barefoot old man grabbed what remained of Stanford Litchwick's hair and dragged the head inland. By day's end, officials had recovered a hand, a wristwatch, a wallet, and the melted remains of a toe ring, all belonging to Stan Litchwick. In subsequent days, the Coast Guard would find both legs, a few shards of a t-shirt, and pieces of the boat, some as far away as Bayou La Batre. Jolene Newberry basked in the media spotlight for a day, giving 15 interviews before 4 p.m. and receiving 2 free nights at Beau Rivage along with $100 in chips for her troubles. She never called Odell. To hell with him. He would have hogged her spotlight anyway. Tattoo Charlie, whose real name was Floyd Smick, answered questions for 3 hours until a bench warrant for an outstanding larceny charge came to light. Then Floyd asked for a lawyer. Nelson and Donatella Litchwick were understandably distraught at their son's untimely passing, but not terribly surprised. It had been almost a year since they'd seen Stanford, a date that had coincided with the maturation of the boys' trust fund. Nelson didn't know his son had been 1AHT, living in Oregon. Donatella had kept tabs on Stan through an old friend in the Oregon Highway Patrol. She knew that he'd lived with a palm reader and that he was well known to the Beaverton police. In addition to multiple disturbing peace and failure to obey a lawful command arrests, Stan was the prime suspect in a spree of SUV arsons. It was with no small sense of satisfaction that the lead detective in those fires paid a visit to Stan's concubine, a pretty girl with heroin eyes and gunmetal blue hair, who went by the name Sky High. Upon learning that her live-in had blown himself to bits in the Gulf of Mexico, Sky asked the first question that popped into every grieving lover's mind. So, she said while picking at the stud in her nose, like, who's gonna pay for the boat?